February 24th, 1944. 20,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The sky is no longer blue. It's metal and fire. The contrails of 4-engine bombers twist like white scars against a gray horizon, and the sound is something between thunder and steel being torn apart. In the middle of that chaos, one B-17 flying fortress drifts out of formation, smoke trailing from 2 of its engines. Holes the size of fists riddle its fuselage. The tail gunner is gone. The intercom is dead. Yet somehow, impossibly, it's still in the air. German pilots orbit the wounded bomber, astonished. Their 20mm cannons had shredded its wings. Their tracers walked up its nose and through its fuselage. It should have folded and fallen long ago. But the fortress doesn't die. It flies straight, steady, stubborn, like something alive that refuses to surrender. Inside, 6 men cling to survival. The co-pilot's hands are slick with blood. The pilot's voice is calm, cold, deliberate. He's trimming controls manually now, compensating for 2 dead engines and asymmetric lift. "Hold her level," he whispers. "Just hold her level." Every few seconds, the entire airframe shudders from flak bursts below. One engine coughs black smoke. The fuel lines are leaking, but not enough to starve combustion. The armor plates over the wings are punctured, yet the main spars, Boeing's masterpiece of overlapping aluminum girders, still hold. The fortress was built for this exact nightmare. It wasn't fast, it wasn't beautiful, but it was brutally over-engineered to survive what physics said was impossible. Below, the town of Schweinfurt burns. The bomber stream presses on, hundreds of fortresses flying in box formation, each a self-contained fortress of 12 50-caliber machine guns. Together, they form a slow, unstoppable wall of steel. Above them, the Luftwaffe's finest pilots dive in pairs, their 109s and 190s spitting fire, aiming to break the formation apart. For every German attack run, 2 or 3 bombers fall. But the rest stay locked, formation perfect, guns blazing in intersecting cones of lead. It's not finesse, it's geometry. Deadly, mechanical precision in the sky. The crippled B-17, call sign Wee Willie, continues limping west, leaving behind a trail of oil, smoke, and disbelief. Over the radio, other crews call out, "Wee Willie still flying." The phrase becomes a mantra, a symbol of what the flying fortress is. Not indestructible, but unrelenting. Every plate, every rivet, every redundant cable inside it represents the same philosophy, that war could be fought by endurance alone. It takes nearly an hour for Wee Willie to cross back into Allied-controlled airspace. When it finally lands in England, it comes down hard, skidding across the runway, one wheel gone, the left wing nearly folding under the strain. The crew climbs out in silence, their faces burned and blackened. The ground crews count 179 bullet holes, one control surface completely severed, both inboard engines dead. And yet, the fortress had made it home. That one landing would become legend, but it was not an anomaly. Dozens of B-17s came home like that, half destroyed, engines seized, fuselage ripped open, but alive. They weren't miracles. They were mathematics. Boeing's engineers had built a machine that turned redundancy into resilience, over-design into salvation. The Luftwaffe would call it unfair. They called it Die fliegende Festung, the flying fortress. To them, it was an iron plague that couldn't be stopped. To its crews, it was something holier, a steel guardian that could take them to hell and bring them back again. By the end of that winter, the balance of the air war had shifted. The fortress wasn't just surviving, it was winning. Every mission it returned from proved that the sky could be conquered not by perfection, but by persistence. And persistence was the one thing the Allies had learned to manufacture. The war for Europe had entered a new phase, one where survival itself had become strategy, and the B-17 flying fortress was the embodiment of that math. The age of invincible engineering had begun. For decades, the B-17 flying fortress has lived in popular memory as the indestructible bomber. A flying tank, immune to gunfire, a miracle of American engineering that could shrug off anything short of direct annihilation. But that legend, like most born in war, is only half true. The B-17 was not invincible. What made it terrifying was that it could fail gracefully. It could take damage that would destroy other aircraft and still function. It didn't cheat death. It managed it. The myth began the way most wartime myths do, with stories that seemed too incredible to be real. Crews would limp home on 2 engines, trailing smoke, landing with gear half down, wings riddled. Glass shattered. Photographers would swarm the wrecks, capturing the holes and scars, images that spread across newspapers and recruitment posters. "The flying fortress brings them home," the captions said. It looked like propaganda, but the images were real. Yet behind each survivor were 10 that never made it back. In 1943, during the height of daylight bombing over Germany, the survival rate for a B-17 crew on an unescorted mission was less than 50%. Entire formations vanished into the flak. Bombers were torn apart mid-air, shredded by 20mm cannon fire, or engulfed in engine fires that spread faster than the crew could bail out. Those that did return often landed in silence, with fewer men aboard than they had launched with. Still, even in death, the fortress taught something, a brutal mechanical lesson about endurance. Engineers studying the wrecks found that B-17s absorbed punishment asymmetrically. The wings and fuselage could lose massive chunks of structure before flight stability was compromised. The reason was hidden inside its frame. Every vital system, hydraulics, control cables, power, even oxygen lines, was duplicated. If one side failed, the other carried the load. Where other planes had single hydraulic pumps, the B-17 had 3. Its tail assembly used overlapping spars that distributed stress like shock absorbers. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, layered with rubberized fabric that expanded under heat to choke leaks before they ignited. The redundancy didn't make it immortal. It made it forgiving. Crews quickly learned to trust that design. When a German shell hit the wing root and tore open a fuel line, the pilot didn't panic, he just switched tanks. When a flak burst, shredded the aileron cables, he pulled the emergency manual cables tucked under the floorboards. When an engine caught fire, the fortress could feather the propeller, shut the fuel feed, and keep flying on the remaining 3. In combat reports, pilots described the aircraft as if it were alive, as if it refused to quit. One crewman wrote, "It felt like she wanted to bring us home, no matter what we did to her." Another added, "She didn't fly fast, she just never stopped flying." The myth of invincibility came from repetition, from the sheer number of times the impossible happened. The B-17 wasn't unkillable, but it was survivable in a way the world had never seen. That survivability changed strategy. Air Force commanders realized they could push further, hit deeper, and still expect crews to come back. In an age before long-range escorts, that mattered more than speed or elegance. German pilots learned it too. They discovered that a single attack run wasn't enough. Even with direct cannon hits, B-17s often stayed airborne, formation intact. It took multiple fighters, coordinated fire, and overwhelming ammunition to bring one down. A Luftwaffe report from 1943 called it a fortress indeed, slow to fall, faster to return. But the deeper truth wasn't about armor or rivets. It was about philosophy. The fortress was born from a uniquely American approach to war, not to build perfect machines, but durable ones. Machines that accepted failure as part of the process. Where the Germans built precision instruments that demanded perfection, Boeing built an aircraft that assumed chaos. It was designed to break and still function, to lose half its systems and still fulfill its mission. The fortress didn't rely on luck. It relied on design logic that turned destruction into a variable, not an ending. And that philosophy, that pragmatic defiance of fragility, would become the blueprint for modern warfare. The B-17 didn't conquer the sky by being invincible. It conquered it by refusing to fall apart when everything went wrong. The B-17's legend began not with triumph, but with failure. In 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a challenge. Build a bomber that could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs for 2,000 miles. Boeing's engineers answered with something no one had asked for, the Model 299. It had 4 engines when everyone else used 2. It had retractable landing gear, a sleek metal frame, and a wingspan wider than anything in the sky. The newspapers called it a flying fortress, the moment they saw its gun ports bristling from every angle. But in October 1935, during a test flight at Wright Field, everything went wrong. The pilot forgot to unlock the elevator controls. The prototype stalled, crashed, and burned. 2 men died, and Boeing lost the contract to Douglas's cheaper, simpler B-18. The Army called the B-17 too much airplane for one man to fly. It should have ended there. But a few Air Corps officers couldn't let it die. They saw something no one else did. A future. They quietly secured funding under service testing loopholes, keeping Boeing's project alive. Inside the Seattle plant, engineers Gifford Emery and Edward Wells refused to give up. They reworked the control systems, reinforced the wings, and improved the aerodynamics. The result was the Y-1B-17, stronger, smarter, and nearly indestructible. Early flight tests changed minds fast. A Y-1B-17 flying from Seattle to Dayton hit bad weather and diverted 800 miles off course, yet arrived within seconds of its estimated time. The Army called it luck. The engineers called it proof. By 1939, as war consumed Europe, production resumed under new designations, B-17B, C, and D. Each version improved on the last, stronger airframes, armor plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks. By the time the E model arrived, the Fortress had its iconic tail fin and full defensive gun layout. It could fly on 2 engines, survive heavy flak, and still carry a ton of bombs farther than anything else America had. It was an aircraft that shouldn't have existed, Too heavy, too complex, too expensive. Yet its engineering became prophecy. Every inch of its design served one purpose: to survive. Boeing built it not to be perfect, but to be forgiving. If one system failed, another compensated. If two engines died, the other two carried on. When war came to the skies of Europe, that design would prove decisive. The B-17 wasn't born in glory. It was born in stubbornness, in engineers who refused to let a crash define their creation. From the ashes of the Model 299 rose a machine built to defy gravity, bullets, and the odds themselves. In the bomber war over Europe, emotion meant nothing. Math decided everything. Every mission flown by a B-17 was a problem of arithmetic, a calculation of weight, range, fuel, altitude, and survival probability. And for most crews, the numbers were merciless. By mid-1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force was losing 1 in 5 bombers on deep raids into Germany. That meant that after 5 missions, odds favored a crew not coming back. The average B-17 life expectancy was 18 sorties. The Air Force's goal, 25 missions for a ticket home, was statistically a miracle. Few made it. Each B-17 carried 10 men and about 8,000 pounds of bombs. Each loss meant 10 trained crewmen gone, an aircraft worth $300,000 destroyed, and a gap in formation that weakened the rest. Yet the bombers kept going, because even that grim equation was better than stopping. The math wasn't about survival. It was about pressure. Industrial, mechanical, human pressure applied until the enemy cracked. Across the Atlantic, Germany faced its own numbers. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter command had burned through 60% of its trained pilots. Every attack on a bomber formation required hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel the Reich could no longer replace. Each B-17 downed cost the Germans roughly 2 fighters. That meant the Americans could lose planes, but Germany couldn't afford to. Inside the fortress, survival was measured in inches. Armor plating over vital systems added 1,000 pounds of dead weight, but it saved lives. The self-sealing tanks reduced fuel capacity, but cut the risk of fire by 40%. The Norden bomb site could hit a target from 25,000 feet with a 300-foot margin, good enough when you had hundreds of planes dropping at once. The most important number wasn't about bombs or armor. It was about endurance. At its peak, Boeing, Douglas, and Vega were producing a new B-17 every 68 minutes. It was the arithmetic of mass, the idea that victory came not from perfection, but from repetition. The Luftwaffe had built masterpieces, the FW-190, the Me-262, but could never build enough of them. The Americans built a machine that could take punishment, repair fast, and fly again the next day. And that was the turning point. Every fortress that returned, riddled with holes, engines coughing, added to a growing imbalance that no German ace could reverse. The bombers were designed to survive. The system behind them was designed to replace. By late 1944, the numbers had flipped. For every B-17 lost, the U.S. could build 3 more. For every German fighter lost, the Reich could replace none. The B-17 didn't win through invincibility. It won through production math, through an equation written in aluminum, fuel, and human willpower. And soon, those numbers would meet their bloodiest test. The sky over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. August 17, 1943, 3. The morning was clear, the sky deceptively calm. perfect weather for disaster. At dawn, two massive bomber streams of B-17s lifted from English airfields, engines rumbling across Lincolnshire. Their mission: cripple Germany's war industry in a single blow. The targets were Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants and the Messerschmitt factories in Regensburg, the twin heartbeats of Nazi machinery. If both fell, Germany's entire mechanical backbone would seize. 376 flying fortresses took off that morning. Each carried 4,000 pounds of bombs, 1,700 gallons of fuel, and a crew that knew the odds. No long-range fighters could escort them that far. They would be alone for nearly 500 miles of hostile airspace. The mission planners called it Operation Double Strike. Pilots called it suicide math. By 10 o'clock a.m., German radar had already plotted their path. Over Belgium, the first wave met a storm of flak, black bursts tearing the air apart. The formations tightened, 10,000 feet above a sea of explosions. When the 109s and 190s dove in, they came in disciplined swarms, firing 20mm cannons and breaking through in waves. A single B-17 could fire back with up to 13 50-caliber machine guns, but no gun could cover every angle. In less than an hour, 20 fortresses were burning. Crews watched friends vanish into black smoke. One pilot wrote, "The sky looked like someone was punching holes through the world." And yet, the formations did not break. Every time a bomber fell, the rest closed ranks. Geometry of survival. Practiced and mechanical, the engineering of the B-17's wings, with overlapping spars and load-bearing ribs, let damaged aircraft hold formation even when riddled with holes. At Regensburg, the first group dropped its bombs dead on target, flattening hangars and workshops. But the return route was worse. With half their fuel gone and engines failing, the surviving fortresses pressed south to North Africa rather than risk the long flight home. 17 crashed in the sea. Dozens more ditched in the desert. Hours later, the second wave reached Schweinfurt. Flak turned the sky into shrapnel. The B-17's armor plating, quarter-inch hardened steel over critical sections, stopped fragments but not direct hits. Planes came apart mid-air. Radio operators burned alive in their turrets. Yet through the fire, the bombers held their line. At 3:42 p.m., they released over 300 tons of ordnance. The factories vanished beneath smoke and dust. Production dropped by 38% within weeks. When the last B-17 landed in England that night, the field was silent. 45 bombers were missing, 500 men gone. Command called it a victory. The men called it math. The raids proved two things at once. The B-17 could hit deep targets with terrifying precision, but the cost of doing so without escorts was unbearable. The fortress had lived up to its name. It absorbed the impossible. But even fortresses can bleed. In the aftermath, engineers reinforced armor plating, reworked gun positions, and improved oxygen lines. The next models would be heavier, slower, but even more durable. Pilots began calling them blockhouses with wings. Schweinfurt and Regensburg became both triumph and warning. The missions broke the Luftwaffe's factories, but nearly broke the 8th Air Force in return. And yet, from the wreckage came the one lesson that defined the war: endurance wins. The B-17 didn't survive because it was lucky. It survived because it was designed to. And that design, the stubborn logic of metal over miracle, was about to turn the air war from chaos into collapse. By early 1944, the balance of the air war had inverted. What began as slaughter had become system. The B-17 Flying Fortress, once the underdog in the skies of Europe, had turned the mathematics of war against Germany itself. Every fortress destroyed required 2,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition to bring down, the same amount needed to sink a destroyer. Each attack consumed fuel Germany couldn't replace and pilots it couldn't retrain. The Luftwaffe was bleeding faster than industry could compensate. Every time a German ace went down, a year of training vanished in smoke. Every time a B-17 went down, another rolled off the line in Seattle within hours. It was a collision between two ideologies: precision versus production. The Luftwaffe relied on elite skill, the Americans on infinite redundancy. German engineers designed perfection. Boeing designed persistence. In January 1944, the U.S. shifted strategy to deep precision saturation. Mass raids with thousands of bombers. The results were catastrophic for the Reich. In the first quarter alone, Luftwaffe fighter losses exceeded 2,200 aircraft. Replacement output fell below 1,000. Meanwhile, the U.S. delivered 1,400 B-17s that same quarter. The B-17 wasn't just surviving, it was multiplying. For every fortress that burned, another 3 were already airborne. And because each plane carried more armor, more fuel, and more guns, they were taking proportionally fewer losses. The attrition curve, once vertical, began to flatten. By February, during Big Week, the equation reached its breaking point. In 6 days, the U.S. launched 3,800 bomber sorties, dropped 10,000 tons of bombs, and shattered Germany's aircraft industry. The Luftwaffe's operational strength fell by half in a single month. Factories at Leipzig, Gotha, and Regensburg were reduced to twisted metal. It was no longer about individual missions or tactical victories. It was industrial warfare in pure mathematical form. The B-17 had become an algorithm of destruction, a machine that turned aluminum and fuel into exponential pressure. German reports described endless walls of bombers, formations so vast that interceptor squadrons ran out of ammunition before reaching the center. Fighter command began to collapse not from defeat, but exhaustion. Pilots flew until their arms gave out, their nerves broke, or their fuel ran dry. The B-17 didn't need to be invincible anymore. It had become inevitable. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies over Germany. Boeing's math had replaced dogfighting with attrition, and attrition with annihilation. The fortress had done what no single plane could do. It had broken the enemy not by power, but by persistence. February 1, 1943. Tunisia. Mission report. Flight of the 97th Bomb Group, returning from a run over enemy lines. Among them, B-17F All-American. Pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg. Altitude, 22,000 feet. Enemy contact, 2 German Bf-109s. The first fighter came out of the sun, cannon shells bursting across the tail section. The second made a head-on pass and never pulled up. At 400 miles per hour, the 2 aircraft collided in mid-air. The 109 sheared straight through the B-17's tail, slicing the fuselage nearly in half before disintegrating. What should have been instant death became something else entirely. The fortress didn't fall. The tail section, half severed, cables flapping, stabilizer gone, still clung to the body by little more than metal skin and luck. Inside, the crew stared through daylight streaming where the floor used to be. The tail gunner was gone. The radio operator was unconscious. The control lines were severed. The stabilizers, crucial for balance, were barely attached. Any textbook would have said the plane was finished. But the B-17 wasn't built for textbooks. Its structure, designed with overlapping aluminum spars and redundant load paths, created what engineers later called tolerant failure geometry. In simple terms, even when a major section broke away, stress distributed through the remaining framework instead of collapsing it. The fortress could lose 30% of its structural integrity and still hold flight loads. The crew tested the controls, sluggish but responsive. Lieutenant Bragg refused to order bailout. "She's still flying," he said through the intercom, voice shaking. "We're bringing her home." They turned west for base. Every gust of wind threatened to tear the tail off. Oxygen was gone. Hydraulics bled dry. And temperatures dropped below freezing. For 4 hours, the All-American limped over the Mediterranean, one engine sputtering, fuel leaking in ribbons behind it. Ground crews spotted her from miles away, a ghost in the sky. They couldn't believe she was airborne. As Bragg lined up for landing, the tail twisted 15 degrees from center, threatening to snap completely. He brought her down at 90 miles per hour, skidding across the runway in a shower of sparks. The tail finally tore loose and fell, 30 yards from the runway's end. Silence. Then cheers. Photographs taken that day became icons. A B-17 cleaved nearly in half, yet somehow intact. When engineers later analyzed the wreckage, they discovered the key: Boeing's decision to overbuild the fuselage frame by an extra 15% for stability during long-range flight. That waste of material saved 9 lives. Reports went to Seattle. Boeing engineers didn't celebrate. They studied. Every patch, every torn rivet, every deformed spar became a data point. The findings shaped the next variant, the B-17G, strengthening the rear section by another 400 pounds of reinforced aluminum. The All-American never flew again, but its story traveled through every hangar and airfield in Europe. Crews began trusting their planes like partners, not machines. Mechanics called it the ghost ship that taught us how to build angels. And from that point on, when a pilot saw daylight through the fuselage and the gauges still read green, he didn't panic. He just whispered the same words Bragg had said over Tunisia. "She's still flying." December 20th, 1943. The sky over Bremen was a furnace. Frost clung to the edges of oxygen masks. Inside the B-17F Ye Old Pub, Lieutenant Charlie Brown and his crew of 10 were learning what the word fortress really meant. It was Brown's first combat mission, and the last one anyone expected him to survive. Over the target, flak shredded the formation. A shell exploded near the nose, tearing away the plexiglass canopy and blowing the navigator nearly out of the plane. His parachute snagged on a bulkhead. He lived. The forward guns were gone. The wind screamed through the open front like a hurricane. Then came the fighters. Dozens of FW-190s dove through the formation. The first hit Ye Old Pub's tail. The second tore open the wing root. One engine died, then another. Machine gun rounds peppered the fuselage. Oxygen tanks ruptured, catching fire. The crew fought flames with gloved hands until their skin blistered. The pilot's arm was slashed open by shrapnel. The co-pilot fainted. By the time the Germans broke away, the B-17 was alone, 250 miles from home, half its control surfaces shredded, the elevator cables severed, and the tail gunner dead. Brown tried to call for help. The radio was gone. He turned the bomber west anyway, guiding it by instinct. The fortress flew crooked, one wing sagging. But it flew. Minutes later, a new shadow appeared, a lone Bf-109 flown by ace Franz Stigler. He saw the ruined bomber limping below him, riddled from nose to tail. Through the shattered glass, he could see the faces of the wounded crew. Stigler lined up his guns, ready to finish the kill. Then froze. He saw no defiance, no fight, only men trying to live. He eased off the trigger, pulled alongside, and signaled the pilot to land. Brown didn't respond. So Stigler did something that defied every rule of war. He escorted Ye Old Pub out of German airspace. German flak crews below held their fire, confused by the sight of a fighter flying wingtip to wingtip with a crippled enemy. Over the North Sea, Stigler saluted and broke away. Brown's fortress staggered home, its engines coughing smoke, the tail nearly gone. The crew bailed out one by one, except for Brown, who stayed at the controls until the last moment. When the plane finally touched down in England, it looked like a burned-out skeleton of metal and willpower. Engineers counted over 350 bullet holes and shrapnel tears. One engine was completely severed from its mount. The tail section was connected to the fuselage by a single spar. The landing gear hydraulics were gone, and yet it had flown 260 miles. The fortress shouldn't have made it, but it did, because its airframe could absorb catastrophic damage and still maintain enough lift and control to fly. Every overlapping spar, every redundant cable, every unnecessary ounce of aluminum had proven its worth. A year later, when Charlie Brown was debriefed, he said one sentence that summed up both the aircraft and the men who flew it. "It wasn't bravery that brought us home. It was the machine." 40 years later, he would find Franz Stigler again. The two men became friends, bound not by war, but by the shared awe of a machine that refused to die. The B-17 wasn't human, but sometimes it acted like it was. By the time the smoke cleared over Europe in 1945, the B-17 Flying Fortress had done more than any machine was ever designed to do. It had survived flak storms, fighter swarms, and the relentless arithmetic of industrial war. It had proven a truth that no ideology, no ace pilot, no perfect aircraft could undo, that endurance beats elegance and reliability beats perfection. The numbers told the story better than words ever could. Of the 12,031 B-17s built, 4,735 were lost in combat. Yet the missions never stopped. They dropped 640,000 tons of bombs, more than any other U.S. heavy bomber. They flew in formations so vast that German observers described them as cities in motion. For every fortress destroyed, 3 more took its place. For every raid that failed, 10 more followed. Germany's best couldn't keep pace. The Luftwaffe entered the war with mastery and left it with ghosts. Its obsession with technological perfection, the Me-262, the He-219, the late model FW-190, created weapons too rare to matter. Boeing's design, by contrast, was brutally simple. Build a plane that could take a beating, be fixed overnight, and fly again tomorrow. The fortress was not just a bomber, it was a philosophy. A declaration that the future of warfare belonged to systems, not heroes. Its design logic outlasted the war. The redundancy of its systems, triple hydraulics, dual control runs, self-healing fuel lines, became standard in modern aviation. Its modular construction allowed damaged sections to be replaced in hours, not days. Even the cockpit layout, clear and logical under stress, influenced every heavy aircraft that followed. The B-17 didn't revolutionize flight through speed or range. It did so through forgiveness. It accepted chaos and still functioned. It allowed imperfect men to do perfect work. And that was the real secret of its success. In the end, the B-17 didn't win because it was the strongest. It won because it never fought alone. Not in design, not in flight, not in spirit. Every plane was part of a greater machine. An industrial empire powered by factories, mechanics, and faith in repetition. When the last fortress flew home over the channel, engines sputtering, wings riddled with holes, it carried more than bombs or crew. It carried the proof that empires fall, but engineering endures. And in that endurance, cold, mechanical, and unbreakable, lay the secret of victory. When the war ended, the B-17 didn't fade quietly. Some were scrapped, melted down, turned into pots and pans for the peace they'd helped create. Others flew mercy missions, dropping food instead of bombs over starving cities. A few were converted into cargo planes, air-sea rescue ships, or training craft. But for the men who flew them, the sound of 4 Wright Cyclone engines would never mean anything less than survival. To a generation that built and fought with them, the flying fortress was more than a machine. It was proof that human hands, when guided by discipline and vision, could create something that outlasted terror. The bomber that began as an experimental prototype became the backbone of a global air campaign that crushed tyranny, one rivet at a time. Today, only a handful remain in the sky, polished, loud, and still impossibly tough. When they pass overhead at air shows, the sound is unmistakable. A deep, synchronized growl that once carried the weight of freedom across continents. The men are gone, the factories are silent, but the logic of the B-17, the marriage of courage and engineering, still defines modern air power. Because the B-17 flying fortress wasn't built to be beautiful. It was built to endure. And in that endurance, it helped save the free world.